as well as the information about today's session. And you can call it really whatever you'd like. Christina Halverson's name is in her box if you need help with spelling that. And you can call this the Maine Board of Social Work Licensing New Rules Update, really whatever you want it to be called, but you'll be populating your own certificate of attendance as you fill out the evaluation form. If you have questions about that process, also please let me know. And so for our format, I'm going to turn things over. Oh, for those that don't know me, I'm Chris McLaughlin. I am the Executive Director of NASW Maine. Hello, it's great to see a lot of familiar names and faces with us today. I'm going to turn things over to Christina and let her chat with us for a bit. And then certainly we'll be open for question and answer periods as well. And this is really your hour. Christina's been so kind to just give us this time. And this is whatever needs you all as licensees here in the state of Maine have for our Board of Social Work Licensing Administrators. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Christina and let her say additionally whatever she'd like to introduce about herself. Maybe share what additional boards she has purview over, which I think is helpful from a perspective-taking perspective. But anyway, enough about me. Christina, take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to see you all. I'm really happy for all the interest that everybody has in the new rules, and always happy to answer questions, assist, or help out in any way I can. The other boards that I am the regulatory board manager of are alcohol and drug, counselors, dietitians, nursing home administrators, podiatrists, psychologists, respiratory therapists, radiologic technologists, and I probably missed one, but it's all the behavioral health boards and a bunch of medical boards. And the unit that works for me, my unit, they have the responsibility for all 9 of the boards. So a lot of times in the time period between like May and August, it gets so crazy busy because we're getting hundreds of applications every day that we have to physically go through. Even if you apply online, they still have to be looked at by the office. So just a little background about what we do. One of the only reason that a board exists, a board or a commission, is to protect the public. And that's in statute. That is Maine law. There is nothing else that can supersede that reason. It's to protect the public. The way I like to explain it is we do the public protection side. Your association does the profession side. So they're there to advocate for the social workers, for the social work profession. We're here to make sure that qualified social workers get licensed, don't break the laws and rules. And when they do break the laws and rules, we discipline them. And that's the difference between the association and the board. Doesn't mean that I can't work with the association to do stuff like this, to give you information and be there to help out. We're not some bureaucracy that's just sitting back trying not to license people. Every day we go to work, my staff and I mean, we're constantly talking. And our goal is always to get someone licensed as quickly as possible, because we know how badly you're needed out there in the field. And that's what drives us. So one of the big things that we do is rulemaking, and it's a huge undertaking. I am currently doing that with all 9 boards because the legislature put some laws in place that we have to do rulemaking for. That is a very arduous task. It's expensive. It doesn't happen quickly, but we really do try to get it done as quickly and correctly as possible so that we don't have to keep going back and forth into it. And this set of rules for the social work board, the board worked very hard for over a year on these. And we got a mandate from the legislature to come up with rulemaking for licensure by endorsement. And during that, just went through all the rules to update them. Doesn't mean they're done. We are going to have to open them up again because there are some items that need to be addressed again in it, but it would have dragged this out for another year instead of at least getting it started. So for right now, what we did was what they call basically a repeal and replace. We pulled all the rules back and then we put them out with updates. And I'll go down chapter by chapter with what we did for changes and updates for each chapter. Chapter 10 of your rules is the definitions. The purpose of the changes to that chapter were to update the term sexual misconduct to include violations that occur during electronic communication. That can be as simple as a text. I cannot tell you how many complaints we have right now that are based on text messages between a social worker and a client, a social worker and a potential client. And it can be something as simple as somebody in one of them sent a heart emoji to a client. They were having a bad day. Well, that's going before the board because that's a cross of the violation line. Anything that you would not do in a physical setting with your client should never be done electronically. And you have to be so careful with that. I would really can't stress enough the importance of the code of conduct that you all are under as well. So make sure you know that. They have a lot of the updated electronic communication, social media requirements. The other thing that we updated in chapter 10 was we didn't change the definition of organic mental illness. We can't, and I'm going to explain why. But what we did do, we updated the definition to reflect the term as used in the most recent version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And we had to do that because that manual is incorporated by reference into your rules. So we have to update it to the most current one when we do the rulemaking. So the definition of organic mental illness is in your statute. And because it's in your statute, the board can't change it. I will tell you the board had quite a bit of discussion about it because it's outdated, as everybody knows, but we can't change what the legislature did. So your statute, your Title 32 statute was put in place as a law by the Maine legislature. Anything that has to change in that has to be changed by the legislature. We don't really have a way to do that. That usually happens when an association or a group or someone who's advocating for something approach a lawmaker and say to them, look, I think this is a problem. I'd like to put a bill in. That's all something that has to happen outside of our purview. When we put bills in, normally it's department bills and it affects all of the boards. When we find a mistake in the rule or something that came out not quite the way it was supposed to, then we can create a draft of another bill to put in. But I can tell you that it's much quicker when a legislature does it because there are 37 boards or programs in our office, and they all have different bills that they suggest at the beginning of each legislative session. I'll be giving my list to the commissioner, but there may be something in another board that is imperative that it gets taken care of immediately. We can't do all of them at once. So I just want to put that out there. In chapter 11, the advisory rulings, we just proposed some minor technical formatting amendments to that chapter. That chapter is basically across the board, applies to all the boards and programs in OPOR, which is the Office of Professional and Occupational Regulation. That's where all these boards are. So that's not something the board had to make any changes to. Chapter 12 is a new chapter. What we did was we repealed and replaced it. It used to be entitled Application for Licensure, but what we did was we relocated relevant provisions in Chapter 13 for the licensure part of it. and replace the rule with a newly created Chapter 12, which is the licensure by endorsement. The goal of that is to be able to get people from other jurisdictions that have substantially similar requirements as Maine licensed much quicker. We can get those licenses issued within 2 weeks tops, as long as the application's complete. Because we know what states now have substantially equivalent requirements as Maine. Staff has a list. We go in and check them periodically to make sure something hasn't changed. So we can do that much faster without as much paperwork having to be submitted. I never like to see someone have to send in their syllabi or syllabus or any of that, because that's just a painstaking barrier as far as I'm concerned. So this Chapter 12 is incredible for people that are coming from other jurisdictions. Chapter 13. So the amendments to this chapter incorporated sections relocated from former Chapter 12. We removed submission of letters of professional recommendation from the requirements. Clarified which licensed professionals are qualified to provide consultation hours. And amended the rule to reflect that consultation hours may be completed in person, through video or audio only technology, or any combination thereof, and may be individual or in a group of not more than 8 members. And also clarify that social work employment, as the term is used in rule, must consist entirely of work that is compensated financially. When these rules first went out for public comment, we did get comment back. A couple of the comments that we got back, the board took under advisement and decided to change that rule a little more. So we put the rule back out. We put Chapter 13 itself back out. And what that did is it added categories of licensees that can serve as consultant for the licensed master social worker conditional clinical, in order to satisfy the requirement of hours needed to obtain the clinical social worker level of license. The rule expands the categories of acceptable licensees to serve as consultants to include licensed marriage and family therapists, licensed psychologists, licensed psychiatrists, clinical counselors, or any similarly credentialed licensee from any state or country. Let me see. The rule also clarifies the board's intents that the hours of consultation required for either an active social work conditional license, applying to be a licensed social worker, or a licensed master social worker conditional clinical must be either in person or via live synchronous video technology or any combination thereof, and may be completed individually or in a group of not more than 8 members. Audio technology is not permitted for this consultation. A minimum of 72 of the 96 hours for the conditional clinical level license must be completed through individual consultation for those individuals with master's degrees in clinical concentrations, and for those degrees in non-clinical concentrations, 144 hours must be completed through individual consultation. So that was Chapter 13. Continuing professional education, Chapter 14. Incorporates new statutory requirement to complete coursework in family or intimate partner violence. It clarifies the retention rule for documentation of continuing education activities, and the scope of acceptable continuing professional educations was amended, specifically delineating the number of hours that may be earned through sessions in which immediate interaction with the instructor is not or is available, and hours that may be earned through teaching, writing, and or independent study. So you can do more hours now, like on the internet, a web-based program, and it delineates that in that chapter. So the rule for Chapter 15, scope of practice, just proposed minor technical amendments to clarify the terminology used to describe the different categories of licenses described therein. Chapter 16, your code of ethics and grounds for discipline. We amended the title to Code of Ethics and Grounds for Discipline. The proposed amendment, the amendments omitted the procedures for imposing discipline in the conduct of adjudicatory hearings, because that's something that is in main law in Title 10, which is the title that oversees or is the jurisdiction that this office is under. And it applies to all the boards. The amendments clarify what activities considered misconduct. They also update the incorporation by reference to the Code of Ethics, the NASW Code of Ethics, approved by the 1996 Delegate Assembly and revised by the Delegate Assembly in 2020, and also amended what conduct is considered sexual misconduct. The Chapter 17 changes were just minor technical formatting amendments. Chapter 18 is a brand new chapter. This is for telehealth. And this rule is based off Public Law 2021, Chapter 291, by establishing standards of practice and appropriate restrictions for when licensees use telehealth to provide services to clients. So that's just a breakdown of the changes we made. And I know that we did an email blast. I'm not sure how many of you actually got to look through these, but I am here for questions or to go through any of it that you would like.
Thanks, Christina. So I think what I'm going to, oh, if I interrupted somebody, I'm so sorry. I think what I'm going to do is facilitate the questions that have come up in the chat.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask people to please be patient with me. I will get you the CE information when I'm not doing 14 things in the same moment of time. So let me get through these questions and then I will go ahead, Christina.
Can I also say too, that if anybody has specific questions about any of the chapters, please feel free to email me. I will send it to you and highlight the answer to your question.
And Christina's email is in the chat, but I will put it in there again because it probably has gotten lost in some of the shuffle. So there's Christina's email. Earlier on in the chat, I've also posted, as Christina was chatting with us, a link to the current rules and a link to the definitions in law and statute that Christina was talking about, making that distinction about what is the purview of the board to do rule changing around and what is more legislative processes around the rule changing as well. So I'm going to start with the chats, the questions that I've seen come in already. Can you please clarify supervision for conditional clinical versus supervision for fully licensed?
When you say fully licensed, do you mean a fully licensed social worker or a fully clinical license?
If that individual wants to come off mute and clarify, or I'm watching the chat and will fully licensed, so the LCSW.
Okay. So the conditional clinical needs, I've got it right here. The conditional clinical license needs consultation with a licensed social worker, a professional counsel, marriage or family therapist, licensed psychologist, psychiatrist, or similarly credentialed licensee of the aforementioned professions from any state or country who served as a consultant. And the amount for applicants whose master's degrees in social work are in clinical concentration, 96 hours of consultation concurrent with 3,200 hours of social work employment has to occur within a period not less than 2 years. And it may be completed in person or via live synchronous video technology or any combination thereof. Now, the fully licensed clinical is an independent license. They don't need supervision according to our rules. I can't speak to what an agency or school department or someone else may say.
Or even just from a best practice perspective,
Right,
Christina, around folks getting consultation as LCSWs, but your point is nothing in the rules requires consultation or supervision for LCSWs.
exactly.
The next question is a clarification, asking if you can review that supervision piece of group supervision of not more than 8 providers. And so the specific question is, does that mean that a group supervision that's happening on telehealth or video cannot have more than 8 supervisees?
It can, but it won't count as individual. You can count 8 or less as individual supervision. If you were to do supervision with 8 or with more than 8, it would be group supervision.
Thank you for that. A question about continuing education. If you teach a college course, how many hours are you able to contribute towards your continuing education?
That is continuing professional hours, maybe you're in person or virtual, just all activities only. Maximum. Sorry, I'm reading to myself.
So I'm looking at chapter 14, and it says that a
Section-
maximum of 10 hours is permitted to be earned through these subsections 2 and 3
Yes.
below, and teaching is one of those subsections. So I'm assuming, Christina, that's the answer. You can only count 10 hours
them.
per licensing review cycle.
Yep. Exactly.
There's a question around the ethics and the assessment continuing education for folks, and it's clarifying that is this for LSW conditional and LMSW conditional clinical? And I think what I heard you say is that chapter 14 was amended to clarify that the psychosocial assessment is only for LSW conditionals.
Yes, that is correct.
What is the change in live versus independent study? So this is again clarifying that 15 hours of the 25 is intended to be done where immediate interaction with the instructor is available. So that's one version of the definition of live. And 10 hours can be done in more asynchronous or on-demand trainings.
Right. And I will say that if you're in a webinar where you have immediate interaction with the instructor, that actually is considered live.
Yes. So as long as the instructor is there and you have the ability to chat with them, should you wish.
Like this would be considered a live one, what we're doing today.
Got it. So today would count towards the 15 hours. Okay. A question about how many ethics for LCSW. I don't think anything changed there, Christina. That's still 4 of the 25.
Right.
Or ethics requirements.
Yep. Yes, for all the licensees except the conditional. It's 4 of the 25.
Okay. There's a question about telehealth. Were there changes to where the clinician and the client must physically be to conduct those sessions?
In order to conduct a telehealth session, here's the way the rule works. You have to be, the client can be anywhere, you can be anywhere, but you do have to make sure you're on a HIPAA compliant platform, that there is privacy, and that, I'm just pulling this up, this is a new one, so. If you, you have to verify the physical location of a client before providing services, and that's so that it's still your responsibility to know where emergency services might be if you think they're needed, or to find out who that person's emergency contact is. I'm looking for the specific. The social worker shall attempt to identify a contact person who the social worker may contact on the client's behalf in a life-threatening emergency only. So the person can be anywhere in Maine. If you're offering services to someone who is physically present in Maine, you have a Maine license, you can be in Alaska and still offer those services as long as you're licensed in Maine. So you don't have to be at a physical location in Maine. If you are in Maine in a physical location, it still only applies to people who are in Maine. The point of service is considered to be where the client is. So if you have a client that goes to Connecticut, you have to check with Connecticut to find out what their law is.
Yeah, I think that's probably one, as in my role with NASW, Christina, that's probably the question I get asked the most is I'm a social worker in Maine. I'm going on vacation. I'm going to my lake house. I'm going to snowbird someplace. Can I still see my clients in Maine? And as you just explained, yes, Maine is a state where the client is located determines the service piece. So I can physically be in Japan, but as long as my client is physically in Maine and I'm licensed in Maine, I can practice. Now, the other side to that coin is we at NASW always encourage people to reach out to the state that they're going to be physically in, because there are some states that require the practitioner, regardless of whether they live in that state or they're only visiting, also be licensed in that state, even if the client is in Maine.
Right. Yeah, there are some states that do that actually.
So that's really good clarification, that for the Board of Social Work Licensure in Maine's perspective, folks are covered as long as their client is in Maine, and they really need to check with the state that they're visiting or co-locating in.
Right.
There's a question about the domestic violence requirement, and I think I can answer this, but certainly correct me if I'm wrong, Christina. That was intended to be a one-time attestation. It's not required. Those 12 hours of DV training are not required every licensing cycle.
No, they're not. And the other thing to remember is if you had that DV training, if you had that DV training, and a lot of the schools now are doing that, and it's a part of your degree, you don't have to do it as continuing ed. You've already got it. It's only if you didn't have that training as part of your education that you have to get it as a continuing ed.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that social workers are attesting that they ever had it, regardless of whether they were licensed at the time they had it.
Right, right.
Christina, there's a question here, and I know it's one that you have gotten often. You and I have talked about this. Can you clarify the piece around LMSW conditional clinicals and private practice work, and maybe shed a little light on what that definition of private practice means for conditional clinical social workers?
So what I'm going to do is actually look at your statute for that one, because in your statutes under section 7053, it gives the functions of each of the licenses. So this was conditional clinical, right?
Correct.
I can't find it. Hang on. Okay, so what was the question again? I'm sorry.
It really is around, there's a couple questions here around LMSW conditional clinicals, private practice, fee for service, those kind of arrangements. What is that definition of private practice that LMSW conditional clinicals and business owners need to be aware of?
So a conditional clinical can't be in private practice. Let me just double check that, because you know what? The counseling is coming in my head. Hang on. Okay, so a person holding a licensed master social work conditional clinical may not engage in private clinical practice unless permitted under section 7053, subsection 1, and must receive individual consultation 4 hours a month while practicing social work in a clinical setting. So 7053, subsection 1 applies to the licensed master social worker, because if you're a licensed master social worker, conditional clinical, you can perform all of the functions of a licensed master social worker. You can't independently perform the clinical aspect of it.
Yeah.
So there's the difference.
And I'm seeing in the statute, in the definitions, private practice is defined as practicing social work on a self-employed basis.
Yep.
And so does self-employed mean that the individual is receiving a 1099 or so an LMSW conditional clinical can be a W-2 employee of an organization. But if they are a 1099 employee, that is what that definition of self-employment means.
Right.
Okay. I think that's I get a lot of questions about that as well.
Yeah.
Christina, back to the continuing education chapter. There's a question around back to that piece around the class. Teaching a class, and in the rules it talks about the first time the class is taught. So the question is, does that mean the first time the class is ever taught, or the first time the class is taught during the 2-year cycle?
No, it's for the first time it is ever presented.
So if there's a course that I'm teaching every single semester, I can only count it towards those 10 hours the first time I ever teach it. I can't count it every 2 years or every year. Okay.
Exactly.
There's somebody asking around perception that the clinician had to be in Maine for telehealth. You've just answered that. The client needs to be in Maine. The clinician can be located anywhere per Maine rules.
Right.
If the client is in New Hampshire and the practitioner is in Maine, then the individual must also be licensed in New Hampshire to see that client. Is that accurate?
If the client's in Maine?
If the client's in New Hampshire, but the social worker's in Maine.
Yes, you've got to check with New Hampshire to find out what they require, but I do believe New Hampshire would require you to be licensed in their state as well.
Yeah. More questions about this 1099 piece. And I think, again, we've clarified that in the law, 1099 and self-employed are seen as synonymous.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not aware of a single source of truth where it says all 50 states what the rules are in terms of do you have to be licensed in the state? Does the client have to be in the state? Somebody's asking, is there a place where that lists all the states and what the licensing requirements are?
That's
Do you know
funny.
if that resource exists?
I actually am doing some research on another part of this rulemaking, and I am finding that I'm having to go into each state and read the law and rule for the questions I'm looking for. But I have seen in the past, if you put your question, like today, I put in a specific question, and it brought me to, I think it was in an NASW site or ASWB, where they broke down by state what requirements were for licensure. I will see if I can find that to send out. I don't know how much they update that site. So for me to actually get the information, I always go to the law or the rule from that state.
Yeah, and sift through it.
Because it changed, like this changed. So when I looked on the site for Maine, a lot of these new things, they're not there yet. So to go by that, which is why it's always best to go to the actual website of that jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think, Christina, also what's been confusing for folks is that during the pandemic, there were some federal emergency standards and there were state emergency standards across all the country. And those standards, those emergency rules may be different. And some
Yep.
states, like Maine, our emergency rules are no longer in effect. Other states may have some emergency rules still applicable. So it really is state by state.
Right, right.
A question about telehealth. Can telehealth therapy be done audio only, or must it be via video?
Going downstairs. All right, so that's going to be in your statute. Let me look at that. And that was added to your statute at the end of the last legislative session. So it'll be in the definitions in telehealth.
Yeah, I'm going to put that link in the chat because I happen to have it up right now. So if you go to that link and scroll all the way down, telehealth services is there.
Yes, and it lists like asynchronous encounters. It's an interaction between a client and a person through a system that has the ability to store digital information, a store and forward transfer. A synchronous encounter means a real-time interaction conducted with an interactive audio or video connection between a client and a person licensed under this chapter. So telehealth services means healthcare services delivered through the use of information technology. It includes the synchronous, asynchronous, store and forward transfers, and telemonitoring. So you can do both. You can do the audio. One thing that you need to look at the rule for telehealth for, though, is there is a part in that rule that states you have to make sure that it is something that is going to work okay for your client.
Yeah.
You may want to have it set up so that you can see them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's under the standards of practice and professional conduct in the Chapter 18 rules.
Yep.
And then there was a comment here that actually I was going to emphasize as well, that just because something's allowable doesn't always make it billable. And to your point, it doesn't always make it the best clinical approach with that particular individual. So people need to check with their billing providers or the different insurance companies to make sure that audio only is an allowable service under a particular plan. A question, Christina, about can you clarify this this piece around the diagnosis? It's no licensed social worker conditional is able to diagnose. Does that apply to LMSW conditional clinical?
I'm going to read exactly what 7053 says. And it's the functions of each level of licensure. And it says no social worker at any level, and that includes the clinical, may diagnose organic mental illness or treat any illness by organic therapy. So what I am going to suggest you do is look at the DMS-5, which is incorporated into your rules, to find out under organic mental illness if that's something you can't diagnose because it's in that list.
Yeah.
Outside of that,
outside of that list, though, Christina, because I was looking at that as well, and that organic stuff seems to also include delirium and Parkinson's and Huntington's disease, some of those pieces.
And
I think this question is around diagnosis, and the person can correct me if I'm wrong, diagnosis on anything outside of that organic stuff that,
if it's outside the organic, yes, the clinical level can do that. So can the conditional clinical.
and I think I'm looking at chapter 15, scope of practice. I think the piece that maybe we're emphasizing here is that they, without the LMSW-CC cannot diagnose or treat without the consultation that's required. If that consultation is in place as required, then yes, LMSW-CCs can diagnose and treat anything except for that definition of organic mental illness.
Right. Exactly.
I'm running, so for folks, if you have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if I facilitated one of your questions and you have a follow-up, or please put that in the chat as well. And so I think the last one here for the time being, Christina, is around, I'm going to read it just as it's written. Can LMSW-CC employees getting a W-2 be paid, quote, fee for service or hourly for their service, with this hourly rate including time it takes to complete administrative work? I think this question is around that LMSW-CCs and private practice piece. So it's asking, can they be a W-2 employee, so hired by an organization or an individual, but get paid for fee for service with an hourly rate that includes compensation for administrative work?
That's more like an employment question, but I don't think that affects, the board doesn't speak to that specifically, but it doesn't affect the hours as long as you're getting the required consultation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the board, to your, I think what I hear you saying is the board doesn't care how much you get paid an hour. It really is, or what that payment is included for. It's really the difference of, are you a W-2, an employee, or are you a 1099, a contractor, an independent practice?
Right.
Yeah, so again, somebody is asking about a change to what the LCSW ability to diagnose, what they can diagnose. And as you've said, what was updated in these rules is the updated definition to match the DSM-5 around organic mental illness, which has been in place for a long time. The rule change just clarifies what the title in the DSM-5 reads.
Exactly. Yeah, it's always been there. A social worker has not been able to diagnose anything in that's listed in that for many years now.
Yeah. Are there other questions that people might have? And I think, Christina, as you pointed out, I just want to remind folks, and I put the link here, that organic mental illness language is in statute, and it can be changed only through a legislative action. The board does not have purview to change the laws, only the rules, and the rule was updated to match the law.
Exactly. We can make suggestions for corrections or whatever, but if there is something in your law that is not up to date with current practice, my suggestion is always please contact your association and your legislators. That's the best route to address it.
So this is now a question about the treatment of organic mental illness. Can you treat dementia if there is a primary diagnosis? I might need this person to clarify the question a little bit more. It says, just to further clarify, can you treat dementia if there is a primary diagnosis of a disorder we can treat? Like depression, that helps. So if the person has depression and dementia, the social worker can be treating the individual.
Right.
The primary focus, I'm assuming, would be the depression, though.
Right. And as part of your social work treatment, you would be assisting in whatever social work methods and theories to help also with the dementia, but you can't treat it or medicate it. You can't treat it with medication, and you can't diagnose it. But if it's a part of what's happening with the depression, it's something you can address.
And I think there's that definition also of the treatment piece as well. And I think in the rules, I'm going to pull that up right now as well. This is chapter 10, the definitions.
Yeah.
And organic treatment is defined as any treatment directly affecting the organs of the body. Example, medication or any type of direct physical treatment.
Right.
So you can talk to somebody about their dementia and how it's impacting their life.
Exactly.
That's not off limits.
And here's a really good example. We had someone with a dual license. They were a social worker and a massage therapist, and they thought the massage therapy would help with what they were treating them for the social work issues, and did a massage and violated laws and rules and got in trouble because they were affecting the actual physical body. You can't do that.
Yep. So another scenario question: if a client is coming to you after they've already received a diagnosis of ADHD, can the social worker continue to use that existing diagnosis?
Yes.
And I think I think people's practice around this might vary. Some people might do ADHD by history, by self-report. There might be ways that the social worker specifies who made the initial diagnosis, but social workers in treatment can absolutely adopt the diagnoses of other providers before them.
Exactly.
Are there other questions, or these have been wonderful? Are there any other questions or comments that folks would like to be reviewed? Christina, the document that you were referencing that kind of summarizes the changes, is that something that we can share with folks?
Sure.
If you send that document to me that kind of summarizes what the major change, I know we don't need to go through this used to be a period, now it's a colon, but or what used to be where, but just outlining those major changes, that would be helpful. And I'm happy to send that out to folks. So as people are getting more comfortable with their own, with our rules, as I suggest you all do, this might be a guide to help outline what specifically is different.
What I'll do is send the fact sheets that we have to send the Secretary of State to explain the changes we're making in each chapter. Those fact sheets will say the proposed amendment, but the amendments happened. So you'll see all the changes in that.
And if people, also as a reminder, if people have public comment they'd like to make at board meetings, there's always a section at every single Board of Social Work licensure meeting that the public is invited to come in and comment on something, anything, as long as it wasn't on that day's agenda or related to a complaint or a complaint process. But if people have suggestions or ideas, the board is an open, transparent process. Are they virtual still right now, Christina?
Yeah, right now they're still virtual.
Okay.
And they probably will be through the next couple of months just because we're not in the building.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But yeah, we do take those comments and we write them down. The other thing that will happen is if it's something that the board wishes to discuss, they'll tell me to put it on a future agenda. But it's always good to get your comments. You're the ones out there in the field, you're on the front lines. I appreciate them a lot.
I just put in the chat a link if people are needing a contact hour for today's session. Absolutely jump on that link and you are able to evaluate the session as well as populate a contact hour certificate. Let me know directly via email if you have any questions about that process. I also wanted to say, from a legislative perspective, as we've said several times now, the board has scope over the rules. The legislature has scopes over the laws. And if people are interested in looking at those laws and providing some feedback, NASW Maine is happy to receive that feedback. And if there are clarifications, if there are modifications, cancellations, or additions that people would like to see happen, feel free to send that to me. And we can absolutely work with our channels here in Maine to review that and see if that's something that we want to propose some legislation around for our state.
Definitely. I will say social workers are incredibly great advocates. I really appreciate
No doubt about it.
that.
So, Christina, thank you so much for your time. I know this was a labor of love for everyone involved, and certainly takes a long time. So, thank you for all you and the board have done to make these changes happen, and thank you for your time today to review and answer those questions from folks.
And thank you, Chris. You were a big part of this too while you were on the board. This was a great endeavor, and we'll be doing it again.
For sure, for sure. For a title of today's session, honestly, put whatever you want, but the invite title for today's session read Maine Board of Social Work Licensing New Rules. So feel free to use the title of the invite. Make this super easy. Don't overthink it, my friends.
Right.
All right, all. Thank you again so much. Reach out. Christina's email is in the chat, several places. Reach out to me anytime. And keep on keeping on. If you haven't joined NASW Maine yet, please consider that so we can continue to bring these sorts of events that are of the benefit to social workers all over the state. We've got a lot of additional events planned in the months ahead. So stay in touch with us, and thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. And thank you for all you do.
Happy Thanksgiving, all. Take care.
Yes.